Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Petroleum and Gas Inspectorate's webinar to introduce the consultation draft of the Hydrogen Safety Code of Practice. Thanks for joining us today. It's just gone 10 a.m, so we'll get started. Firstly, I just want to note that the webinar is being recorded and it will be available later on our website for anyone that was unable to attend today. And also, please, if everyone can keep their microphones muted until the end. There will be some question time at the end. You can either use the chat box during the webinar to raise questions, or at the end you'll be able to raise hands and have a Q&A session. Firstly, let us take a moment to reflect on the meaning of place, and in doing so, recognise the various traditional lands on which we do our business today. We acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we live, learn and work, and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging. Specifically, I'd like to acknowledge the Woolgoorooga and Bindal people of the Townsville region, where I'm presenting from today. I'd like to start with a safety moment, maybe a slightly different take on a safety moment, looking at hydrogen, which is why we're all here today, as a fuel gas, similar to the fuel gases we already know, but it's not quite the same. So really just looking at some of the differences and why hydrogen's become increasingly popular of late. So firstly, it disperses very rapidly, which can be a safety feature. It doesn't accumulate easily. It rises at approximately 60 kilometres per hour, a lot faster than natural gas, and the opposite of LPG, which accumulates at ground level. It has a very wide flammability range in air, 4 to 75%, but its buoyancy, diffusivity and small molecule size make it difficult to contain to create a combustible situation. It also gives off significantly less radiant heat than a hydrocarbon flame. And lastly, of course, one of the main drivers for its popularity is it's climate friendly. It's a carbon neutral or zero carbon fuel. And as long as it's being produced from renewable sources, it is a carbon zero solution. Okay, I'll move into the contents for today's presentation. So we're going to run through a little bit of background around hydrogen in Queensland and the safety regulations in Queensland, and then we'll get into the code of practice and the policy proposals that we've put forward in the draft code of practice. By way of introduction, on the line today, Paul and myself will be chairing the meeting. I'm the hydrogen lead within the Petroleum and Gas Inspectorate. I currently have COVID, so hopefully my voice will last the entire presentation. If not, I'll hand over to Paul at short notice. And I think Paul's also might be struggling with the same thing. So Paul Beaumont is our Principal Inspector for Gas Work and Devices and Gas Licensing. Marshall Holmes is on the line. He is the Executive Petroleum Engineer for Pipelines and Distribution Networks. We have our Deputy Chief, Radhika Lucas, on the line today. And Cecily Coleman is our Policy Officer and has had a lot of input into the drafting of the code as well. Tony O'Connor is on leave at the moment, but is the Principal Inspector for Fuel Gas Delivery Networks, which includes the refuelers. We also have GPA Engineering supporting the development of the code and on the line today, and they will assist with taking minutes. So the objective for today, the main reason is to present a really high-level overview of the draft code that we've published and to talk through the policy proposals. So the code itself doesn't set out new requirements as such, but we have identified a number of areas within our existing legislation that don't enable the hydrogen industry. So what we've done in the code is put forward policy proposals, and that's what we're seeking feedback on. Today's session is about explaining those policy proposals, and we've allowed some time for questions at the end. So please pop questions into the chat box through the webinar, and we will have an opportunity at the end to raise your hand. Any questions we don't get through today, we will attempt to answer through email or a published response. So please continue to send your questions through the email if they don't get raised or answered today. So hydrogen in Queensland, The Queensland Government is committed to developing a sustainable hydrogen industry, and we're really focusing on the third aspect of this, ensuring effective legislative, regulatory and policy framework. But in doing so, we're actually supporting all 5 areas of that strategy. There's a number of resources available through the Hydrogen Industry Development Fund and the Investor Toolkit. So gas safety regulation in Queensland. There's really 2 key safety regulators in Queensland from the gas safety perspective. They are RSHQ and Workplace Health and Safety Queensland. We work collaboratively with Workplace Health and Safety, and Workplace Health and Safety cover the general workplace obligations, and they will also be the lead regulator where there's a major hazard facility. Petroleum and Gas Act and the RSHQ regulate on top of the WHS where hydrogen is being used as a fuel, and specifically around operating plant and gas devices and gas work, where there's a licensing framework. Hopefully that'll all make a bit more sense as we step through the presentation today. There's also electrical safety provisions that apply across the board, and the electrical safety office is also we work collaboratively with them on requirements and compliance. Should also note here that hydrogen is regulated under the Petroleum and Gas Act when it's used or intended to be used as a fuel. Where it's used for other purposes, it does not fall in the scope of the Petroleum and Gas Act. So this is a bit of a pictorial of the petroleum and gas legislation scope. So where hydrogen is being used for fuel purposes, such as fueling vehicles and being dispensed to those vehicles, transported in pipelines for heating and purposes in homes, combustion purposes in homes, and also for generating power, that's classed as being used as a fuel gas. Where it's a major hazard facility, for example, export facilities, where it's being used in existing industries such as manufacturing and agriculture, and also the production of hydrogen through electrolysis and green processes is out of the scope of petroleum and gas legislation. So how does the PNG Act apply? It's really in 2 key parts. One part of the, so this is the safety provisions under the Petroleum and Gas Act relate to operating plant. Operating plant facilities and activities such as suppliers of hydrogen, refuelers, pipelines and distribution networks. For operating plant, the risk is really managed by the operator through a safety management system, and the Petroleum and Gas Inspectorate do proactive work with inspections, audits on operating plant to ensure that the safety management system is achieving its objectives. On the other side, gas worker devices is a more prescriptive part of the legislation. Gas devices must be approved. Installers must hold a gas work licence authorisation, and the gas systems must be installed to specified standards. These are existing provisions in the Petroleum and Gas Act, and hydrogen as a new fuel needs to fit into this framework, and that's what the Code of Practice is attempting to bridge the gap between what's currently in place and what needs to be in place. In terms of the scope of the gas safety regulation and the Code of Practice, this here is sort of defining the 2 distinct areas, operating plant being your blending facilities where they exist, hydrogen and gas distribution systems and pipelines, refueling stations, and delivery networks to those refueling stations, including cylinder filling if that is occurring for fuel gas use. Gas systems and devices are your actual devices that combust or use the gas, so combustion devices or fuel cells. Includes mobile fuel cell systems such as in vehicles, and also stationary fuel cell gas systems where you may have a closed loop system that produces, stores and uses the hydrogen in a fuel cell. Some of the things that have been out of scope for the code include export, where it's most likely to be a major hazard facility, hydrogen enhancers for diesel engines, which are generally below the LEL, very small amounts of hydrogen are added. We will work with the heavy vehicle regulator on these projects if there's storage of hydrogen on board the vehicle. So why a code of practice? The code of practice is intended to provide a consolidated framework on how to comply with the current legislative requirements. It does not set new requirements, but it enables the industry to develop within the existing framework by removing some of the regulatory barriers. The reason a code of practice has been proposed as opposed to a guideline is because some of the requirements in the current legislation are prescriptive. This includes odorant. Currently, there's a prescribed odour for hydrogen that cannot be complied with in the current fuel cell market. To remove the odorant requirement, there needs to be an alternative safety requirement that achieves the same level of safety or better. In the case of vehicles, for example, the onboard safety systems that have leak detection and automatic shutdown would be an example of an alternative safety measure to odorant. So the code proposes a solution that recognises this safety feature and removes the requirement for odorant in these situations. RSHQ also recognised that the industry is developing rapidly and that national competencies and standards are continuing to develop. These will be reviewed and adopted as they are released, and in the long term, the code may become a guideline. So we're working with government and industry stakeholders through the development of this code of practice. The timeline so far has been, we had a discussion paper, and I know many of you were on an earlier webinar around the mobility sector and the discussion paper, and we got lots of feedback from industry on the discussion paper. So we thank you for your responses and hope that you can see the feedback in the draft code, how it's been taken on board. I'll now go through the policy proposals for operating plant, and then I'll hand over to Paul Beaumont, who's going to talk through the gaswork and device proposals. Please remember to pop questions in the chat box as we go. The operating plant. For the most part, the operating plant provisions can be applied to hydrogen operating plant directly because they require a risk-based approach. They require the operator to determine how they will manage the risk and address this through their own safety management system. There are a couple of areas under the operating plant section that are prescriptive and that have presented an issue that we've addressed, that we've proposed some solutions for. So firstly, gas distribution networks have a mandatory requirement under the Petroleum and Gas Act to comply with 4645 Australian standard ASNZS 4645. This standard has a limit of 15% hydrogen. As it's a mandatory standard, there's no workaround legislatively for this. However, this means that networks that have 100% hydrogen or blends with over 15% cannot legislatively comply. The code proposes to enable, to enable the safety management system, formal safety assessment, to be used instead of 4645. Proposal includes a notification to the Chief Inspector that the gas network will be using a hydrogen blend or product that is outside the 4645 limit, and provide a summary showing that that risk has been addressed through a formal safety assessment. And the second proposal is a larger challenge, the odour requirement. So currently, legislation prescribes an odour for fuel gas, and the obligation is on the supplier of the fuel gas to odorise. The only time that it can be supplied without the prescribed odour is when it's being supplied to an industrial site and where the supplier has ensured a risk assessment has been undertaken by a person authorised by RSHQ. In the emerging market with fuel cells that are intolerant to odour and being used in non-industrial settings, this doesn't work. Policy proposal in the code is to essentially shift the requirement to the consumer. The obligation of the supplier would then be to ensure the gas system that they supply unodorized gas to is certified as safe for unodorized fuel gas. It's similar to the existing requirement for an operator to ensure the system they're supplying is certified before initiating fuel gas supply for LPG or natural gas, for example. There's an existing gas compliance certificate process. So this proposal is really adding on a requirement for unodorized fuel gas to be also certified supply. And it really shifts the obligation to the owner of the gas system. I'll let Paul talk through how that might work in the next couple of slides, because it's about the gas device and gas system being safe for the unodorized fuel gas supply. It obviously will not apply to refuelers and dispensers. It'll be managed through the approval process for the vehicles where there's a dispenser station. There's more information in the code, and Paul will talk through further information on how this can apply in the next couple of slides on gaswork and devices. Paul, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Nancy. Okay, morning everybody. As Nancy mentioned in earlier slides, the gaswork and devices sector is much more prescriptive than the operating plant sector. We rely on Australian standards and to build our safety requirements, and the standards can either be preferred or mandatory. At the moment, we have no preferred standards for fuel cells or hydrogen in general terms. So what the code proposes to address that is to introduce a term called reference standards. So I guess we could say that that would be a stepping stone from not having a standard to being a preferred standard. We would reference it in the code, and then eventually once the standards are nationally recognised, we would pull them into the legislation. We also have a challenge that there are a limited number of gas device approval authorities that can approve fuel cells. So in Queensland, the framework is that all gas appliances or gas devices have to be approved prior to supply, installation or use, and we assign those people who undertake that work as a gas device approval authority, and we restrict their scope or their limitations based on their experience, their skills and their knowledge. So we have a limited number of people that meet that expectation for fuel cells, and so the code it proposes a new process for fuel cell gas system approvals. And then we move on to the installation requirements, which again, within our legislation, the preferred and mandatory standards are really focused on LPG and natural gas at the moment. So we have no preferred standard for hydrogen gas system installation, although we note that through our legislation we could apply section 2 of 5601, which gives a framework of what performance and essential requirements would need to be addressed, but there is no prescriptive standard for that part. So the code proposes that we introduce a new term of type B device and call it a fuel cell gas system, which would include the localized production of the hydrogen, the storage of the hydrogen and the use of the hydrogen. And that fuel cell gas system would need to be designed by an RPQ engineer and include leak detection and automatic shutoff, and complete installation instructions as part of the design. We don't address the unodorized gas risk in the current installation requirements because, as Nancy mentioned, it sits at the moment with the supplier of the fuel gas. But the proposal is that through the definition of a fuel cell gas system and the engineering design, the risk from that unodorized characteristic would be through the leak detection and the automated shutoff. And then we move on to our gaswork licenses and authorisations. And currently we have no units of competency, no nationally recognised units of competency or training package that's recognised for hydrogen. And so our gaswork requirements document, which is where our requirements for licensing and authorisations doesn't prescribe anything for hydrogen. So currently, gaswork licence and gaswork authorisation holders are limited to LPG and natural gas. And we've had no national competencies for fuel cell installations. So the code proposes, actually, it's not really the code that proposes it, it already exists, but there is a pathway whereby the Chief Inspector can issue a gaswork authority based on knowledge and skills. So this pathway can be applied in the short term to applicants who provide relevant knowledge and skills, and also a need for the work. So if there is a project underway, or they're proposing a project, the Chief Inspector can issue a gaswork authority to undertake the work on the basis of that project. Once national competencies are established, we will simply call those up into the gaswork requirements document, and then they'll become the requirement to have hydrogen included within the scope of any licence or authority. Next slide, please, Nancy. So the challenges to our framework in relation to fuel cells in vehicles is the way the legislation is written. The fuel cell must be approved for installation and use. The ADR, the Australian design rules, don't yet provide safety requirement for the hydrogen fuel systems. And again, the work to install, maintain or service to carry out gas work in relation to a hydrogen fuel cell vehicle would be under a gaswork authority. So what the code is proposing is to list UN R134 as a reference standard, and call that up as the minimum standard for mass-produced vehicles. The Australian Vehicle Standards Body have indicated that they intend to adopt similar requirements to GTR 13, and once that happens, maybe we can change our approach to this, which is another benefit of having the information referenced through a code of practice, because changes are more readily, they're more efficient and more timely. The draft includes further information about applying for a gaswork authority, and obviously we'll take in those applications as they come in. We do have another challenge that traditionally Type B gas devices have been approved on an individual basis, and because fuel cells are a Type B gas device, the fuel cells, stationary fuel cells, it may be appropriate to approve them individually in a unique approval for the particular site or location of the fuel cell. But when it comes to mass-produced vehicles, this becomes problematic. So the code of practice is suggesting or proposing that the Chief Inspector has a power to approve gas devices at the moment, and the code of practice is proposing that it will be a blanket approval for imported vehicles that are already certified internationally to that UN R134 standard. And also it's proposing a multiple device approval option via an appropriate GDAA. So if we had a gas device approval authority that had the hydrogen system within scope, vehicles or stationary, there may be an opportunity for the GDAA holder to approve multiple devices. So in a way, trying to mirror a type test approval scheme in the short term. Thanks, Nancy. Next slide. So just a summary of the policy proposals. The code proposes to prescribe the ISO 14687 hydrogen quality standard, a formal safety assessment supplied to the Chief Inspector for distribution networks supplying more than 15% hydrogen by volume, enabling supply of unodorized fuel gas when the owner of the gas system meets the safety criteria. So that would be through that RPEQ design sign off with safety shutdown systems. An amendment to the regulation to define all hydrogen delivery networks as operating plant. The use of reference standards for gas device design and approval in the absence of preferred or mandatory standards. The use of reference standards for gas system design and approval and installation in the short term where there are no preferred or mandatory standards. The provision of a gas device approval authority scope to approve multiple type B devices on the same approval if they are all of the same design, and new terms, so new definitions, I guess, as in fuel cell gas system, reference standard, and an updated term of a gas fuel system, which relates to a system in a vehicle that delivers fuel gas to an engine for propulsion. So back to you now, Nancy.
Thanks, Paul. Yeah, I think that's it. As Paul said, this slide was really all of the proposals that are in the draft code. If you have a read through that, they're explained in more detail in the code itself. And hopefully we've sort of touched on a little bit of what they're about in the presentation today. So really the next steps for us will to gather all the feedback, and then we'll look at taking that on board and adjusting as required over the next couple of months, and publish a final draft sometime in August. Now, the code of practice, because it has got those policy proposals, and it won't be a final document until the regulation is updated. Obviously, it cannot exist independently of the regulation, so the regulation needs to be aligned with what's in the code of practice. And so that's why we're coming out now for some consultation to get feedback on those proposals before we go through to amending the regulation. And a future update to the reg, we'll look to enact the final version of the code. So I guess that's it. We wanted to go through those with you today, and I can see some questions in the chat box already, so we can move to those now. It's really probably the next half an hour or 45 minutes, whatever, just some Q&A time, and we look forward to your feedback, and thanks everyone for coming today. I'll just start quickly and say, yes, the webinar is being recorded, and we will be making the slides and the recording available through our webpage. So once that's all up, we will send an email out to everyone that's subscribed on our list. Okay, Radhika, did you want to lead the questions, or I'm happy to?
I can throw a few, Nancy. Yeah, I've been following some of the questions. So we can, yes, you've answered, is the session being recorded, Nancy? You just answered that, and will the slide pack and the recording be available? Yes, it will, as you said. Let's go to this one. So a question from Stephen. How does the code override the regulation? You know, I know you just answered it, but can you just explain it just for completeness?
Yeah, I think that's probably an important one to, just gonna stop presenting. That's an important point. Like, this code obviously does not override the regulation, and the current legislative provisions apply. And I think that's certainly written right up the front of the code as well. Just the policy proposals in the code are not current; they're not the current legislation. So if there's anything where a proponent can't comply with the current legislation, please talk to us so we can work with you on how that might be addressed in the short term. But in the longer term, the code will become part of the regulation. So the policy proposals will go through a regulation amendment, and it'll be, and I think Enzo, you had a similar question. The legislation will actually refer to the code where required, and some of the other proposals will actually come into the regulation directly. So depending on how policy and the legal drafters do that, it'll either be referenced from the regulation to the code, or the proposals may just come into the regulation directly.
Thanks, Nancy. We can go to the next one of another questions by, I think, Jason Vella. Does the code address a consumer that has two streams, one that cannot be authorized, fuel cells, and another that should be type B appliance?
Yeah, so that's a good question. I think the key point here is we're putting the obligation onto the owner of the gas system to determine how they're going to manage safety, particularly around unauthorized fuel gas and leaks. So there are some options there. Odorant is still an option. If that is the chosen option, that is the acceptable method now. where odour isn't used, and so a Type B appliance could be supplied unodorised fuel gas if that's chosen, then they need to have other safety measures in place that needs to be part of the design. I know there's one application where they are going to odorise it because they're seeing that it's coming in unodorised, but they're using it in a combustion appliance, so they're going to odorise, and that meets the safety requirement, and that's okay. If you've got a stream that's doing fuel cells as well as a combustion appliance, it may not be practical to odorise, in which case you need to manage that safety for both the combustion and the fuel cell.
Yeah, thanks, Nancy. There's a good one from Chris Roos. Sorry, I misspelled your last name, but I don't see any discussion about the production of hydrogen via electrolyzers and approval of these devices, which will form an integral part of many refueler sites.
Yeah, yep. Look, really good question, especially on the refueler side. So it's currently not in the scope of the petroleum and gas legislation because it's using electrolyzers. Obviously, use water. That's not a petroleum feedstock, and production of fuel gas is not part of the scope of the legislation. We're looking at that, and where it may be more practical to regulate that as part of the petroleum and gas operating plant, we'll liaise with WHS. So I think it's a good point, and that we will need to look at that. We have defined a fuel cell gas system. So where it's in a closed loop, you've got a electrolyzer with a storage and a fuel cell. We're looking at packaging that, and we believe that would make sense to regulate that as one system, in which case we will regulate.
Yeah, thanks, Nancy. I see that, Chris, you've put your hand up. Yeah, I'd like to open up the floor to you.
Yeah,
ahead, Chris.
Just a quick a point about this electrolyzers. It's not really. It's once you've produced the hydrogen, it's how you're containing it and controlling it after it's actually come out of its or it's been produced. Yep. And I think you've got another device that's there in the system that really needs to have the scrutiny of safety around it. You know, it's not just we're buying something and putting it in place because it's been approved somewhere else. There's a lot that needs to be addressed in that and installation work as well.
Yeah, absolutely, Chris, and that's good feedback, and thanks. Please note that down when your feedback. It sort of supports when we want to go back and look at that legislative position. It supports that to say, look, we're getting, it's part of that whole system, and we need to look at all of the components, not just sort of once it comes out of the electrolyzer, as you said. But certainly at the moment we're working with WHS, and obviously the Electrical Safety Office, and all of these components have a certain electrical safety compliance as well. So we're working with both those regulators as we go through these projects.
Yeah, thanks, Nancy. We'll pick one more from the fuel cell and then go to a few GDAA questions. In the event of a fuel cell producing hydrogen for fuel use and non-fuel use, does the code become the dominant compliance obligation?
Fuel cell, so like an electrolyzer where it's producing it for two different purposes. I think the way we've determined to split that is once the hydrogen is produced, PNG legislation or the requirements under our legislation are applicable as far back as it's intended for fuel use. So when it's being produced and stored, if there's multiple users, we wouldn't be regulating that. It would be a WHS or a manufacturing facility. Once it's, for example, in a tube trailer to go to a refueler, we would start regulating from that tube trailer that goes into the refueler, where it's solely for fuel use. Where the end use is mixed, I think it's probably up for discussion, but I think it would be a WHS manufacturing activity until it's solely for fuel use.
Yeah, thanks, Nancy. We have another question from Anita Gandhi. Thank you, Anita, for your comment there. It says, hi, Paul and Nancy. Good presentation question regarding GDAA for type approving hydrogen vehicle. I understand the proposal is to adopt recognize UN R134 as the certification. Does the vehicle get automatic approval, or will it still need to go through GDAA approval?
Or would you like to answer that? I think I'm talking too much.
Yes. Yeah. In essence, what it would be probably incorrect terminology, a blanket approval by the Chief Inspector of vehicles that are mass produced and design and already hold a certification to that standard. So they wouldn't get an individual certificate or an individual assessment.
Okay, thank you, Paul. Another quick one, Nancy, from Jeffrey Poon. Hi, I would like to clarify whether marine vessels are outside or inside the scope of the proposed code.
So marine vessels, for example, passenger ferries and boats that are using hydrogen as a fuel, in a fuel cell or in a combustion application, are within the scope of the legislation in Queensland. The big vessels, like the export vessels, especially if they're using hydrogen or ammonia as a fuel, those big vessels are not in the scope of what we would regulate. They're they're in the international maritime laws. We wouldn't regulate those, but the smaller vessels, the recreational vessels and use in Queensland waters, yes, similar to what we do with LPG now.
Thank you. Another one by Kim. Sorry, Kim, I won't pronounce your last name. I don't want to butcher it. Is there any work being done to produce a unit of competency for licensing?
Oh, throw that at you.
Yes, there's several projects nationally looking at the units of competency for gas fitters and for fuel cells. There's already a suite of units of competency for the utility side of the industry, but we're still waiting on the finalisation through the Australian Skills Industry Committee for the units of competency for gaswork licence holders and gaswork authority holders.
Yeah, thank you, Paul. Let's go to this one from Tom. Can you talk more about the policy rationale for out-of-scope items, for example, exclusion of green hydrogen production, which could be below a major hazard facility threshold, distinction between hydrogen used as a fuel gas or other purposes? For example, if hydrogen is being produced and transported for ultimate use as both a fuel source and agricultural use.
Yeah, look, it's a good question. It's one of those confusing areas because the Petroleum and Gas Act really relates to fuel gas, and our legislative scope is around the use of it as a fuel. So we can only regulate the fuel gas purpose, which is why we exclude the other non-fuel gas purposes as it's currently excluded. There's also the green production question. That's because we don't regulate production of fuel gas. So the water that's used to produce the hydrogen through an electrolyzer is not a natural, it's not a resource like petroleum, so we regulate petroleum at that production stage, but not fuel gas. And so that is currently a manufacturing process under the WHS Act. And we would work with them for sure. And in some applications, we'll have an MOU in place to work out the most effective safety regulation framework. But in terms of what's within the current scope of our legislation, production of fuel gas from sources such as water is not within our legislative remit, I guess is the reason.
Thank you, Nancy. Another one from Kane. As a design needs to be signed off by RPQ, do you see this as a group of mechanical, electrical, process chemical engineer, RPQ engineers, as there is no gas discipline through BPEQ?
Yeah, look, I think obviously RPEQ have a certain scope they can work within, and they need to work within the area of competence and expertise. And it'll be up to those RPEQs doing those designs and sign-offs to ensure that they have the right skills and competency to do the system that they're designing. And yes, I could imagine that there would be a more than one discipline required for many of these systems.
Yeah. Similar one, is RPEQ exclusive or can general CP be an appropriate qualification for engineers?
Yeah, look, I think we would be happy enough with the CP because that's the equivalent of RPEQ. However, in Queensland, not under the Petroleum and Gas Act, but there is a requirement for engineering work to be done by an RPEQ. So that's separate to our legislation. That requirement already exists. We're leveraging it, but it's already a requirement in Queensland.
Thanks, Nancy. Just anyone in the attending, did you want to put your hand up and just ask a question? Go for it. Yeah, Grace, great. We see Neil Dennis. You go ahead, please.
Yeah, hi Nancy and everybody. Just with the RPEQ question, I note over time that there will be a mutual recognition program probably developed through various states. So I'm hoping the code of practice would be automatically updated as those programs come into play.
Yeah, absolutely. And I see a number of comments there around the consistency and working with other states. So absolutely would be working with other states. And as I said, from our perspective, we would be comfortable accepting this, the CPENG, given that is the equivalent of RPEQ. And really that RPEQ requirement is separate to our legislation. We're leveraging it. But even in terms of the process we're proposing, we are looking at wherever we can using Australian standards, which I think all of the regulators do around the country, and the national competencies around for licensing. We're also looking at ensuring that we use that same framework. We're not trying to put anything different in place. I guess this code is bridging a gap where there's currently not a way to comply with the legislation, and putting a pathway in place so that you can comply, and that will be a flexible framework that will certainly take on the national competencies and standards as they come out.
Thanks, Nancy. Jason Vella.
Hi, Nancy and Paul. Nice to talk to you again. Something that's come up on our project just recently is the metering requirements and accuracy. I've struggled to actually find anywhere that gives us guidelines from an industrial use. There's a SAE requirements for fuel cars and that, but nothing I can find regarding an industrial application and the quantities we're talking about on our project. Is there going to be a guideline for there, or is it going to be left between the supplier and the consumer to come up with an agreement?
I'll have to look at applicability, and Marshall might know better, but there is a chapter in our legislation on measurement of fuel gas, and I believe this would, hydrogen being supplied as a fuel,
It'll automatically fall under that. Yep.
Will come under that metering requirement. So there's some general provisions there that we can regulate under that. Obviously, the code of practice has addressed the safety things at the moment, and metering at, for example, dispensers is not part of the scope of that chapter of legislation. So I'd have to look at metering for the supply to industrial site if it's not through a pipeline. But yeah, certainly custody transfer points are covered in our legislation under the measurement chapters. So have a look at that, and I'm happy to take it offline maybe if there's more questions.
Thank you for that, Nancy.
Nancy, just a point of question there. Yes, our legislation covers measurement from a pipeline, but not at a dispenser. That's under weights and measures.
Yeah, so if it's being supplied from one site to another, I think there's not much of a pipeline there, is there, Jason? Then we'd have to look at the applicability, I guess, of that chapter.
No, we're going to put a pipeline in, so where we've got a storage, we're actually going to put pressure regulation down to distribution pressures and a meter. We just got to agree on what the accuracy of that meter is. But again, I'll go find what's required for fuel gas, and we'll say that's the minimum requirement.
Yeah.
Correct. Yeah. Please look at Chapter 8 of the Act.
Thanks for that.
Thank you. Rob, language.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks for the great consultation. I think it's great to see the robustness of the questions. So look, I've probably got a couple of questions. One is, how are we working with the Commonwealth and the other states to ensure that we've got national consistency along this line? I know even in your consultation, you refer to the WA side having similar requirements to Queensland. So that's question one.
Yep. So I think you're talking in the vehicle space, Rob?
Yes, I am. Yes,
Yeah.
I should have introduced myself from the Federal Chamber of Automotive Industries. Yes, so
Yeah.
Type B gas devices.
Yes, as it turns out. Look, thanks for the question. We have, you're right, worked with the similarity we have with WA is Queensland and WA both regulate the vehicle component of fuel gas use, which some other states, the gas regulators, don't do that. We have spoken with the Commonwealth Standards Vehicle Regulator, and as Paul mentioned, there's GTR 13. Australia are a signatory party to those global technical regulations, and GTR 13 is around the gas, hydrogen safety and the system of the hydrogen and fuel system. Australia hasn't adopted that global technical regulation as yet. The the EU have, and that UN 134 is the standard that they've done, which the vehicles are certified to, that meets the GTR 13. So I guess what we've done in the interim is said we accept that as meeting the requirement, and longer term, the preference would certainly be for that to be part of the vehicle registration requirements in Queensland and Australia. But at the moment, there isn't a requirement there. So I guess that's why we've done it through the code.
Yeah. Well, we'll certainly continue to work with the Commonwealth to see if we can push that along a little bit. You know, we'd like to have consistent regulation nationally.
Yeah.
So thanks for that response. The second question that I had is in relation to the supply of mobile gas system, that the owner of the vehicle or vessel then must produce evidence of compliance with the elements. In a practical sense, that sort of says that each vehicle owner has to, prior to fueling up, provide some evidence. Are we going to control that more appropriately through registration processes, through TMR or something like that? So, for example, if the vehicle is registered, that's demonstration that it has already been complied to UN 134.
Yeah, well, I mean, at the moment, I guess it doesn't have to have the UN 134 to get registered. But Paul, what are your thoughts on, or did you want to answer that question around how we interact with the TMR? Like, there's an existing arrangement with autogas vehicles.
Yeah, so the existing arrangements sit around the fact that there has to be some evidence on the vehicle that it meets the approval. So we'll be what will we doing? We'll be sharing there'll be some sort of list of register of the vehicles that have been approved by the Chief Inspector. We'll be sharing that list or register with TMR so that they know that those vehicles are approved. And I just probably it's good to make a point that the point of providing approval for those vehicles isn't really to regulate those vehicles, it's to regulate the other vehicles, some that might come out of other places or other pathways that don't meet those requirements. So we're going to try and make it as pain-free as possible and unobstructive. But yeah, we'll be talking to TMR about, so there is a current requirement that they need to see a gas system compliance certificate or an inspection certificate for a vehicle with LPG, and we'll be trying to mirror that requirement.
Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Nancy, there's a comment I want to share, then I'll come back to you, Enzo, after this one. From Susan. It's a comment, not question. Separating the manufacture of hydrogen from the transport and usage burning of hydrogen might help with regulation. Perhaps we should see hydrogen as a new manufacturing industry in Australia. Thinking maybe hydrogen isn't produced, it's manufactured. Did you want to have a follow-up comment, Nancy, to that?
Yeah, look, it's a good point. There is yeah, it's really a manufacturing process, and I think that's part of what we've sort of found coming through it. It's as opposed to petroleum, which we tend to treat as a production process. Yeah, it's manufactured as in we take a product like water and manufacture hydrogen. So yeah, it is a different way of thinking about it, and that might help with the way we go through and do the work with WHS and working out how we regulate the sector. Sure.
Thanks, Nancy. Go ahead, Enzo.
Yeah, look, firstly, a comment on what was just said, but also a question for Paul on fuel cell systems. But with the hydrogen being a manufactured gas, I've read recently that they're in South Australia, I think it was, they're talking about exploration of hydrogen as a naturally occurring gas. So that's something to consider. Yeah, that's something to consider. But my question for Paul was around the fuel cell gas systems. Biofuel cell gas system, Paul, are you talking about basically a piece of plant where you've got a fuel cell and other equipment, or you're talking about an integrated system like, you know, one that shall remain nameless at the moment that you and I have been looking at? Are you talking about something in a box that contains a fuel cell electrolyzer, the metal hydride storage? What do you actually mean by fuel cell system?
Yes, so fuel cell gas system we're defining as yes, a system of those components. So the electrolyzer, any storage, whether it be metal hydride or whatever, and then the use of it through a fuel cell if it is contained on one location.
And comes within the one package, I guess, is what I'm getting at.
Not necessarily within the one package. No, that's probably the main difference. Yeah.
Okay. And under those circumstances, I'd assume you'd be applying various standards or various applicable standards depending on what piece of that system you're looking at.
That's correct. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Paul.
Just so everyone knows, we've got 10 minutes left. We'll try and cover as much as possible and then close out. But Nancy and Paul will consolidate, all the questions will be answered. Yeah, just letting you know, I've been able to touch on most of them. So Mike Hyde, you can go next.
Yes, good morning. It's my understanding that most Type A and Type B appliances work quite adequately without modification to a value of about 8% hydrogen mixing natural gas.
Sorry, Mike, Nancy, can you hear Mike clearly? It's cutting in and out for me.
Yeah, it's cutting in and out, but I think you're asking about blends being supplied to Type B.
Yes, I'm asking about blends below possibly 8%, where a Type A appliance may not need any modification and will work perfectly okay. Is it intended that they will also need to be certified, and the gas installers that work with those appliances will also need to have an approval for hydrogen?
Well, I'll let you answer that around hydrogen blends.
Thanks, Nancy. Yeah. Hi, Mike. If the blend still meets the requirements for the national standard for natural gas, then it's still considered under legislation to be natural gas. So if it's a blend, you're quite right, it is around about 8%. If there's a blend of, let's say, 10% or less, we would still consider that to be natural gas. And so there's no reapproval of any appliances, and a current gas work license would cover that. Does that answer your question, Mike?
Thank you. That does answer my question.
Very good. I've got one right.
Thanks, Paul. Anita Gandhi, do you want to go next?
Hi, Paul and Nancy. The question I have is, yes, you did touch base on the vehicles, which has got that UN certification. Does this code also cover mining vehicles, the off-road ones, which doesn't fall under the registration part?
Yeah, it is within the scope for sure. And so whether they comply with 134, that's it, and a pathway that they could comply with and get the, go through that approval pathway. But if they chose to use a different standard or meet the safety requirement in a different way, then they could go through the pathway with the appropriate engineering design and still have those safety features in place. So it does apply, and if they can use 134, then that's good. If they want to choose a different design and standard pathway, they just need to go through that engineering design and have it approved.
But that pathway is not described, so it is left to the proponent to come up with that pathway. Is that right?
So they can use the pathways that are there, I guess. So one of the pathways is 134 compliance, so they can use that. And if they don't use that, they have to use the alternative pathways, which is also there. But I guess it's up to the design of those off-road vehicles, on how they're going to comply.
Cool. Thank you.
Paul, I'm not sure if I mentioned this one from Kent. Will the prerequisite for a hydrogen endorsement be a GWL, or will a standalone hydrogen license be achievable?
The second one, an individual hydrogen license would be achievable. Standard across the board, we would expect the gaswork license holders to move through the units of competency when they're defined to include hydrogen within their license scope for general licensed gas fitters. But if there was a necessity to issue a license or an authority for a particular type of, so it was another trade, say an electrician, that required the hydrogen endorsement to be able to do work on fuel cells, etc., we can accommodate that within our licensing framework. So in short answer is it wouldn't be a prerequisite, and there are other pathways, but the license would be conditioned appropriately for the work that we covered.
Excellent. Thanks, Paul. One more from Anthony. The Northern Territory does regulate the auto gas systems under the Dangerous Goods Act, which currently calls up AS 1425. We will be looking, I think there's a question there. Will we be looking into this soon?
Tony Wade here from Northern Territory. I'm Director of Technical Services up here. The Dangerous Goods Act will be looked at in regard to inclusion of potential inclusion of hydrogen. The Northern Territory Government is currently looking at the strategies and the legislation that will enable us to do that, whether we do it through the Dangerous Goods Act or through a separate piece of legislation. It's something we're looking into. So we'll be interested to see how Queensland progresses on the hydrogen strategies and their hydrogen codes of practice with a view of consistency across the board.
Yeah, thanks, Tony. We're happy to work with you as you go through that too, and we can certainly let you know our learnings.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Tony, for that. I actually did convert your statement last line into a question, did I? Apologies. Nancy, we've got 4 minutes left, so I'll hand it over back to you.
Okay, thanks everybody. Hopefully we've touched on most of the general areas of questions and answered the main questions. The Code of Practice is open for consultation until the 24th of June, so there's still plenty of time to have a look and submit your feedback. There's a, I'll just put up this slide again so that we've got the our contact information available there. If you need to contact us, please send us an email and jump to the end. We will get back to you as soon as we can. If you've got any particular projects that are starting now and you don't not sure about how to comply, or if there is a requirement, please reach out. We're happy to work collaboratively with projects that are progressing earlier than what the code is going to be enacted, I guess. Any last questions before we close?
I'll just see that we've still got 2 hands up. Are these from the previous questions, Mike and Jason, or you've got your hand up again?
It's Jason. Just a quick one. With the odorant type, where we're looking at dosing the hydrogen, we're doing some work with a supplier, but because the current odorant use on natural gas is not suitable for hydrogen. So as part of our submission, if we supply that supporting documentation and why we're using it, and our gas advisor supports that, is that how we would get that approved through the gas inspectorate?
Yeah, Paul, I'll let you answer that. I'm not sure if the odorant itself, I don't think needs to be specifically approved. It just needs to be distinct, unpleasant, and to 1/5 LEL. Is there any further approval requirements for the odorant in the gas system, Paul?
No, there wouldn't be any further. If it is odorized, it would be odorized. So that's okay. Yeah, there would be no further requirements. No.
Thank you.
But I mean, I've spoken to you before about this, haven't I, Jason? It's good to keep us informed, and if we can use your information you've learned, that'd be great.
Yeah, we've been in discussions with ICE about an approved odorant for hydrogen, and they do have one which is already used in Australia. So spot leak 1005 looks like it's okay to be used with hydrogen, whereas 1009 you can't.
Right, thanks, Jason. Right, thanks, everybody. We'll close it there. And as I said, the presentation and recording will be made available on our website, and please get in touch for any more questions.
Thank you, guys.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. Bye.